Okay,
Call to order.
we should be live.
I call the meeting to order with my co-chair. Roll call
Mayor Pro Tem Mersch
Here.
and Mayor Wilson.
here.
Okay.
Public comments. I see no public, so no comment. Approval of minutes, are there?
Nope.
Okay. Moving to old business, none. New business, wow, all the way to number 6.
Okay. Robert, we are at your item.
Well, thank you all, and thank you for being here or being there this afternoon. Talk trash.
Love talking trash.
Exactly. As usual, I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to go through, and then we can kind of go from there. So I'm going to share my screen with all of you, and it should be right here. And let's make sure that you can all see this.
Yes.
All right, good. Okay, so, I really want to kind of focus on what I think are the 2 key issues that we're trying to address. I mean, kind of what's broken. And I shared this with you the last time we talked about this, that really in fiscal year 2020, before I got here, there was a change in how residents were billed for their trash services, refuse services. And that change was essentially that there was an attempt to determine which parcels, which properties had temporarily stopped receiving services. And you can see that I put in parentheses presumably, because I'm not sure how they determined that, or at least the method to determine that seemed arbitrary, because they're trying to make that determination in April or May before the billing starts, when the services, construction could go on anytime throughout the year, or it could resume anytime through the year. And I'm not using the term suspension of services because, remember, people aren't subscribing to services. They either pick up containers at any property that puts out containers, because they don't keep track of customers. They just provide services kind of globally, and they receive compensation globally. So what happens to individual properties or parcels is not relevant to them. So, but in any case, in 2020, there was an attempt to determine this temporary suspension, if you will, of services. And essentially what it meant is that because there are no customer accounts, as I said, being maintained by Republic, nor do we do the billing, it's a pretty laborious and difficult process to make that determination. And I suspect that in the past they relied, or city staff has relied on what was called a route audit performed by Republic, which seemed again odd. But they would go out, and their drivers during their normal routes and pickups, they would, for a week or so, or 2 weeks, not sure, and they would try to make a visual determination of who was receiving services and who was not on a temporary or otherwise basis. The upshot of this was that starting in fiscal year 2020, there was a decline in the number of parcels that were billed because of this, and led to lower revenues and inconsistent billings in the last few years, because every year there was a kind of a change in what was determined to be a temporary suspension of service. Then on top of that, there are 15 parcels that have never been billed, at least as far as I can see. Going back to 2019-20, just parcels have never been billed. Some of them it makes sense that they weren't billed, but 15 of them there's nothing that I found that would tell me why they're not receiving services. They've got property addresses, or at least some address there, parcel numbers, but they've never been billed. And so that's, I think, a secondary issue we may want to sort of tackle through this process. So there are 2 alternatives that I outlined before, and I wanted to just kind of summarize what those are, and you can go into them in more detail. So there's a policy approach, and there were some questions about this in the last meeting that I didn't probably do a good enough job of answering. But essentially, the policy approach is more to guide how we do things internally, how we process buildings and our practices around that. And the focus of a policy is to ensure consistent building practices, to streamline the processes, and to achieve revenue stability. Even if perhaps even revenue growth, but for sure revenue stability. An ordinance approach is really a different way of approaching this issue. It's really about establishing a local law, because an ordinance is a local law that carries some enforcement powers. But the focus is more on equity, meaning everybody who gets services should be paying, and I'll get more into that in a moment. But it's also about ensuring compliance with state diversion laws. So cities and governments that impose or implement mandatory trash ordinances or an ordinance around that are really trying to address where they see potential issues with compliance with state laws, where there's illegal dumping or things like that, or public nuisances. So they're trying to address those kinds of issues. A byproduct of that, at least for us, if we were to take that approach, would be the same as the policy, which would be to achieve revenue stability, revenue growth potentially, and then of course, when you have revenue stability and potentially growth, then you have a more financially sustainable refuse fund. So let's talk about the policy approach. So again, the whole policy approach is, like the ordinance, is to address those two key issues that I highlighted. One was the temporary and then the permanent suspension of services. And a policy would just basically be adopted that says that that any presumed temporary stoppage of service will still be billed. So it's sort of reverting back to where we were prior to fiscal year 20, where there was this attempt to determine who's temporarily stopped receiving services, and just go back and just have a policy that says, no, we don't really see a temporary stoppage of service as a basis for not being billed because we bill on an annual basis. Making that determination is really almost arbitrary, but certainly very, very difficult to do in advance. And the policy should also define clearly the circumstances under which a parcel is deemed to permanently not require any services from the city's contracted hauler. And I'm trying, I don't know the community as well as the two of you, but I can imagine that there might be a vacant lot or a permanently unoccupied property where maybe green waste is being removed by a private hauler or a gardener or a resident, but otherwise aren't receiving regular services or aren't putting out the containers on a regular basis. So that might be a circumstance where we might say, okay, we're not going to build those parcels. It still would require some effort on our part to make those determinations, particularly in the first year, but then every year to make sure that we know what those parcels are, because that could change. But again, it's addressing those two issues. The advantage of the policy approach clearly is that it's easier and more expedient to implement. It's just adopting a policy on a given Monday, and we're done. So it's more just easier to implement than an ordinance. And as I said, it essentially reverts back to the pre-fiscal year 20 approach, except that we're adding those parcels in the mix that were historically have not been built, and maybe potentially building some of those. So it does achieve the goals of revenue stability and reducing the staff workload that we currently are having to go through, and will potentially or likely result in increased revenues. The disadvantage of this approach, which is not necessarily significant, but it's still important to note that it still places a burden on staff to determine each year which properties meet the exemptions or exceptions for being billed. And those are the permanent ones. But it's also important to note that a policy is really to guide internal processes and procedures. It's really not something you can enforce upon a community. It doesn't have any enforcement powers, if you will. So we're going to be maybe challenged to enforce these rules and maybe lead to disputes. The ordinance approach is really, again, is where we're effectively mandating the city's the use of the city's refuse hauler. So we're saying everybody's got to, it's not subscribed because, again, they don't sign up, but everybody's got to use Republic for their trash services or regular trash services, with certain exemptions. But I mean, and the argument for a mandatory ordinance, and why you see cities doing this, as I kind of alluded to, is that there is potentially some concern that waste isn't probably being processed in accordance with state law, or maybe the residents, are sharing bins either voluntarily or involuntarily. So we might have some freeloaders, if you will. So it's really about that. That's kind of the big argument for that. And we think that if you have these kind of concerns, that's kind of where a mandatory ordinance would be more appropriate. Again, you allow for exemptions, and there are many ways to provide exemptions. But as an example, you can allow for self-haul or private haulers in certain circumstances, kind of like what we talked about with the policy approach, a vacant property or a non-occupied property for most of the year. An ordinance would really put the burden on the property owner to show us that the waste is being properly disposed of, like providing us, waste tickets and things like that, either monthly or maybe quarterly. We can exempt properties that generate no waste, and I don't know, again, the community as well as you do, but if there is a situation where a property of maybe a vacant lot that really generates no waste, not even green waste, then they would be exempt. And again, the burden of proof would be on the property owner versus the city staff. I mean, the approach would be, you're all going to be billed. You have to come to us and tell us why we shouldn't bill you. The advantages of this is because we don't have that customer data. An ordinance mandating the trash service. It avoids, it eliminates the chances of bin sharing, and it does ensure that trash is being disposed of properly, because we're looking for evidence that if they're being privately hauled or personally hauled, that they're going to show us that it is being properly disposed of. And as I said, it does put the burden on the property owners versus city staff having to make a determination. The disadvantages, depending on how we structure the ordinance, there may be some more enforcement that's needed. Therefore, it's going to have an impact on staff, workload, and the like. From a political perspective, you may get residents, really complaining that this is really too onerous, unnecessary. What's the real problem you're trying to solve? And maybe more appropriate if there is, in fact, that concern where waste isn't being properly disposed of. We're seeing, and I don't think it's happening here, but I know a lot of communities are seeing this illegal dumping occurring. Large number of public nuisance cases where people aren't taking care of the weeds and letting grass or weeds grow, things like that. That might be the reason why, if there's that kind of concern, why an ordinance approach might be more appropriate. So what I would, and I'm going to turn it back over to you, but, what we're looking from the committee is to consider the merits of both approaches and recommend one of those to council. If you have other thoughts on how we might approach this issue of, dealing with, quote, temporary suspension of services and those permanently not being billed, we can consider those, of course. Or you can just recommend no action to council and say, we're not going to bother with this. It's not a big enough an issue, and we'll just kind of continue as we're going today. My suggestion, at least I say staff suggestion, I've not really had a chance to go over this with City Manager Chang, but just my perspective would be that, as I've looked at this more, read up on it more, and looked at what other communities are doing, it might be appropriate to start with the policy approach, because we're really able to address. That said, we're not going to be, waiving billing those who are temporarily not receiving services. That we're going to include those. That immediately is going to address one of the issues that we have with inconsistent billing, and the work that is associated with trying to figure that out. It's going to increase revenues and provide that stability. So it might be make more sense to start with that. And try to address those and investigate those that have not been billed on a permanent basis or historically. And if it's not working and we still see issues, some of the more sort of public health issues or equity issues, we can kind of consider an ordinance approach later on. But certainly, it's really how you want to approach this. And I'm open to your thoughts and suggestions. So I'll turn it over to you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Robert. Okay,
Sure.
I wasn't here at the last city council meeting, so I don't know the context of the discussion. Was there?
Yes, there was a discussion, and the discussion was primarily this. There's very little in this that was not in there. And the council just decided to
Yeah.
give it to us, so.
It's pretty much the same
Yeah,
staff report that
maybe-
went to the council, but the council thought it was best to put it to this
We
committee
were trying to move on.
to bring a recommendation forward. So
Yeah,
they said he's had enough
Community
time
member
away.
Wilson, If I could just really quickly give you a quick summary what the issue with drove all this is that we found that over the last several years, there have been properties that have not been built, and that changed every year, which they were not rebuilt, and it was because they were presumably, not using services on a temporary basis. They're under construction or temporarily unoccupied. And it's really, it's one of the reasons why we've seen the revenues going down in the refuse fund, which of course drives the need for more subsidy out of the general fund. And that's kind of what drove all this analysis. And as part of that, I identified that there are a number of parcels that aren't being built, that have not been built on a permanent basis. And that the overall approach that's being used, the route audit doesn't make sense as a way to determine who should not be built. And, we're looking for a way to achieve this, more stability, more sustainability, and address that workload impact. And so that was the thing that was brought back to the council. And so in the context of the budget discussion, and again, as somebody mentioned, they asked that we're directed that we have this discussion with the Solid Waste Committee.
Okay, so I wanted to ask that question, Robert. Early on in your presentation, you said that there's been a decline in revenue. So my question was, are you talking about a decline in revenue for the city or for Republic?
The city.
No, not for Republic. Interesting, so it's really just been to the city's refuse fund. The way Republic, interestingly, gets billed is at some point in time when they either renewed or entered into contract, they determined or calculated their compensation on 685 parcels. And my guess is that they determined that about 685 on any given year is on average what they are servicing, because there are probably 715 parcels in total. Some of those shouldn't be billed, like school district or the city. But they just made a determination that we're going to, based on 685, this is how much we're going to want to get paid. And every year that's really a fixed amount now that gets increased every year by CPI. There's no evaluation of how many, in any given year our parcels are receiving service. They just get a fixed amount increasing every year by CPI. So they don't really care about, who's not receiving services, who's being billed, who's not. They get paid no matter what.
Okay, so I remember, I think when I was mayor last time, 5 years ago, Elaine was struggling with this process back then, trying to identify which parcels were receiving service and tying that to Republic's bills to us. And I understand it's a little tricky to do that. I didn't realize that there hadn't been some resolution since 5 years ago, basically, or 4 years ago. But we know that there's some parcels that are undeveloped, and ordinarily I wouldn't expect them to pay for service unless, they had gardening service with clippings and stuff like that. I don't know. I couldn't identify these 15 vacant parcels or the ones that have no service. And another question I had was this contract predates both Leah and myself. So let me sidestep this for a second. Did anybody ask Hidden Hills how they do it?
I can't say that staff has
And I don't think
checked
we
with them.
asked anything about Hidden Hills when we were negotiating this contract either.
Well, I don't. Do they use Republic? Do you even know?
Oh, I don't know, but I'm just, not that many cities actually do the collection.
I totally get that. It's not unique, but pretty close. I think actually PVE has a similar type service. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I'd just be curious how Hidden Hills deals with this, because I'm assuming they deal with an issue where they have not driveway pickup, but at home pickup, and it would just, we don't have to follow their policy by any means, but it just they've instituted or implemented a policy, and maybe it works. I don't know. It might be a good model to look at. But I'm curious, the contract we have with Hidden Hills, Republic right now predates both Leah and myself.
No, we did it.
No, we did the
We renewed the
extension,
contract.
renewal. Yeah, but the contract was there before.
But the items in the contract we did. We may not, I don't remember the 685, but that number, but,
Well, no, we made some adjustments to it. I'm not taking away from the work we did, but
No.
the basic contract format predated us. It just seems to me that somewhere there should be, I don't know if there is, but there should be some kind of a policy already about how we charge our residents and how Republic charges us. It seems really loosey-goosey.
well, and I think, Pat, in all fairness, that's been part of the problem, that when Elaine started looking at this, I don't think it was at that level. We used whatever formula they used to determine how we were going to do putting it on their tax bills. And then at some point, someone said, gee, this is a different number than what we're showing that we have.
Okay, so right, sorry to be so basic about this, but Republic is billing us whatever the monthly rate is, 14 something, or?
Whatever the amount is, each
Times-
time it's
times
685.
685?
That's right. And whether we're billing
Yeah.
685, if I'm understanding correctly, Robert, is we've been trying to match to that 685. We don't match to the 685, and people are going crazy trying to get to the 685. And it was brought up in a council meeting one time. People started looking at it and said, oh, well, how come this amount of money is going down? And, the money that we are collecting from the tax. This year, when we took a look at the budget and where we were going, that was an issue that came up.
Yeah.
There isn't a policy.
So, if you remember back a number of years ago, the amount that was being billed to our residents was adequate to cover the full cost of the services for how much we were paying Republic.
Well,
And then the
Robert, hold
decision
on.
was made that,
Hold on a second.
Isn't it?
That's not true if we were paying for parcels that weren't being charged. I mean, the dollar amount per
Yeah,
parcel,
again-
we might have been billing, but there still seems to me it seems that there would be a deficit in there somewhere.
no, because prior to fiscal year 2020, 699 parcels were being billed year after year. Even though there were still the 15 or so that weren't being billed, the 699 was being billed was adequate several years ago to cover the cost of what we were paying Republic. When council decided that it would that it was going to keep that amount billed at $1,100, the dynamic was that the compensation to Republic went up every year by 3 to 5% based on the contract. As that number, the compensation went up, then we're creating these annual deficits, and we had reserves to cover those deficits, but eventually, that gap has now become too wide that even at 699 parcels, if we were to build 699 at $1,100, that would not cover the cost to repay Republic. We would have to raise that $1,100, as we've been talking about, as a rate increase in an amount that's going to be closer to $1,300 to $1,400 per month or per year in order for us to properly raise the money to pay Republic.
Okay, if what is let's say it's $1,400, because I don't know the exact amount that Republic is charging us. If we charge our residents, or if we stop subsidizing our residents, we're still going to be underwater, right?
No, because what's happening is that the general fund has been keeping and making the refuse fund whole, right? And they've been making that fund whole for for the difference between $1,100 and what's really needed to be charged to each resident to cover our costs. If we raised our fees, we would raise them in an amount that when you add up all the parcels times, take them all and multiply it by $1,400, whatever that number is, we will come up with a dollar amount that is adequate to cover the cost, the amount that we're paying Republic. That would be the exercise that we would calculate it that way. We would make sure that whatever the monthly or the annual amount is going to be enough to cover the cost of Republic. Now that rate increase could be smaller theoretically if we implement policies or an ordinance that address, to get us back up to 699, because we are billing about 685 right now, give or take. That's truly what we're billing now. We didn't build 699. We could likely be billing more like 705, closer to 710, and so that the math reduces the amount we'd have to raise each parcel by in order to achieve the same dollar amount. But if we don't do anything different, we're going to have to raise the fees somewhere between $1,300 and $1,400. It'd be a little bit less if we implement any one of these, either the policy or the ordinance.
I've asked the questions that answers will be relevant to me, but I'm not anywhere, I'm not getting anywhere on this. What do you feel?
Well, I have
Let me just say, the best way to sort of summarize this is these two alternative actions, either an ordinance or a policy, will raise additional revenues. And my guess is going to be in the order of, on an annual basis, anywhere from $25,000 to $40,000 per year. That's what the impact or the result of any one of these two actions will get us additional revenues.
Okay,
we need more like we need $250,000, however, in order to close the gap between what we're charging residents today and what is being paid to Republic. So we can lower that impact to the ratepayers by $25,000 to $40,000, but we're still going to have to, if we're going to eliminate the subsidy, we're still going to have to raise rates, in the 25 to 30% range.
Robert,
if we're going to balance.
Robert, the 25 to 40,000 you're talking about, is that at the $1,100 per year rate?
$1,100 per year multiplied by the number of parcels that I think would be billed that aren't currently being billed because they've been they're presumed to be temporarily not receiving service. If we eliminate that as implement a policy that says it doesn't matter if it's temporary, you're still going to be billed because we bill annually, that'll automatically pick up 20 or so parcels. We may pick up some of the ones that have permanently been, sort of unbilled for years that we determine that, no, they should be billed. So again, we might pick up 25, maybe more than that, maybe $40,000, but not much more than that at all. So it's still not nearly what we need to close the gap. If we looking at what's needed to balance the fund, it's either raising rates by 25 to 30% or continuing the subsidy from the general fund in the order of $200,000 per year.
Do we have residents that come in and request a temporary suspension of rates? How does a temporary suspension get initiated?
Well, from my perspective, in the time we've been here, I have not had a resident come in and do that, but we should ask John because
we don't negotiate with them. We are not the service provider. Republic is the service provider, and if they want to contact Republic, we're going to give them the number to Republic. It's right. To me, this is this is only about the fact that believe me, I want the revenue. I'm not trying to put that aside. I'm not trying to be cavalier about that. And the issue about whether we're going to raise the subsidy, let the subsidy go or whatever, to me, that's a whole other discussion. To me, yeah. We have a systemic problem here in how we are billing how we're doing the billing, how we are putting this on the people's, determining who's getting it on their tax records or not.
Right.
And so, right. To me, okay, I am not in favor of an ordinance at all. And because all the things that you cite that might be better with the ordinance, it makes it more legal and you can enforce it. Everybody knows enforcement is expensive. It still takes a lot of staff time. It's not like if you have an ordinance that all of a sudden makes it easier. So I like the concept of having, excuse me, a policy. And the things that you cited, Robert, as far as what's good about having an ordinance or a policy, those could be our reasoning for why we're doing the policy. In other words, equity, assuring that the trash is going to the right place, all those kinds of things. So I'm all in favor of having a policy so that people understand, staff understands, and our residents understand who is being billed for things. I do not think an unoccupied property, not an undeveloped property, I do not think an unoccupied property should be exempt from the trash collection service. Whether they're gardeners or can put something out, when you don't live in a property, you still pay property taxes, you still do all kinds of things, even if you aren't residing there. So so if you have undeveloped property, you may not have power to it, so you don't have to pay an electric utility. But I would recommend that we, every property owner, whether it's lived in or not, inhabited or not, because I don't want to put staff or anybody else in the policing department of running around and saying, oh, this house used to be uninhabited because the lady was in an assisted living care facility and now they're back. So I just think I just don't want to go there. So I'd have that. Everybody should pay. Whatever rate we're going to determine we're going to pay, you pay it. And then as far as undeveloped property, if nobody's living on it, I mean, if there's nothing there, you know, I think that's something that we need to talk about. Our trash service includes all kinds of things like, you know, your large pickup. It includes the bins. You know, we're not going to be going out there and saying, gee, you have an undeveloped property, but if you want to cut down a bunch of your trees, you can't put them in our communal bins that we have. If you want to bring stuff from believe me, we have people that bring in their stuff to the shredding that own undeveloped property up here, don't live here, but they say they can come here because they own property up here. So I think that we do provide services, whether the people choose to use them or not, but the services are still available even to undeveloped property, but I'm a little more flexible on that. But we know how many undeveloped properties we have in the city. We had to turn it in when we did our 6th cycle and all that. So we know how many we have, and I think those are the only people. Everybody else should have to pay, whatever rate it is that we decide to bill.
Yeah, so that's great. And Committee Member Wilson, if you agree with that, so I want to ask a question about the undeveloped properties. Are you comfortable with the idea that unoccupied parcels will still be billed if there's a structure there, and that if there's a temporary stoppage of service, like for construction purposes, that they still would be billed? It's really where we're going to focus is on the undeveloped properties where we can potentially have some wiggle room there as to whether they get billed. Are you all both in agreement with that?
I have a question first. While you were going through your presentation, I started wondering, okay, we charge on the tax bills, but home owners don't necessarily sell their homes consistent with the beginning or the end of the tax period, you know, January 1st to June 30th. I presume that we collect the taxes from the assessed, whoever the taxes are assessed to, but is there any provision? I mean, I don't remember, 25 years ago, I don't remember, well, most people don't even notice on their tax bill that they're paying this, so they don't question it. But how does it work when somebody sells a home? Because sometimes it might take more than a year to
Yeah.
transfer the tax bill to the new owner? I mean, we just keep charging the
Yeah.
assessed property owner?
No, I mean, whenever a property sells in the middle of a tax year, everything's apportioned out. So, if you own the property for 3 months during, then in the tax calendar, then you're going to be paying only 3 months worth of property tax. It's all prorated and it's all done through escrow. So that includes anything that's on that property tax bill, including the refuse assessments.
Okay. So to answer your prior question, yes, I'm comfortable with the way Leah has described it.
Okay.
I'm a little uncertain
Okay.
myself on whether we should charge the parcel owner if there's no development. They may be the biggest abusers if they're getting the property ready to develop
Yes.
and they just put a bunch of trash cans out. Which reminds me about something you commented earlier about sharing bins or something like that. I mean, I don't think that's an issue. I don't know. I guess there's a few streets in Rolling Hills where the houses are close enough where they could share trash cans, but I'd say for the most part, that would be a heck of a hassle.
Yeah.
Well, and not only that, the chances of those rare occasions being a vacant property being one of them, if there's only 15 or so vacant properties in the whole city, again, I have mixed emotions. Maybe you charge them a reduced fee if if a property is undeveloped.
How would that work for Republic though?
Well, it won't, but it's not working for Republic right now either. So.
Yeah. No, but I mean, Republic does not have an issue with the way they're getting paid. They are perfectly happy with the arrangement because they don't have to worry about maintaining records and they don't have to worry about dealing with all that. They just get paid, regardless of who they pick. Again, I think they're dealing with averages, and I think they're comfortable that the level of services, the number of parcels that they're servicing is reasonable and not putting a lot of burden on them, and they're still enjoying their compensation that they don't have to worry about. Well, the one thing I wanted to, so let's focus a little bit, if you don't mind, on the undeveloped parcels. So one of the things we could do is if we determined that they are truly undeveloped, that we would say if we're not going to build them, we would probably give that information to Republic and say, okay, let's make sure, and can you make sure that these parcels that are undeveloped are not receiving any kind of service, meaning you're not picking up any container, even if it's a green waste container, and just to ensure that, to kind of, and if they have any containers, to take them from their property. And then that puts the burden on them to have either do a self-haul or have their gardeners take that green waste, or the trimmings or whatever they have periodically, that they're taking them away themselves and disposing of them versus using Republic's services. That might be a way for us to do that.
Well,
another way would be more onerous. We would say to them, hey, we're going to allow you to not be billed. However, we need to have you provide us evidence that you are, with waste tickets, again, more onerous, but still through a policy, we're asking them, can you provide us evidence that you are, in fact, disposing these things, whether that be monthly or quarterly or annually? That's just the two alternative approaches.
I'm sorry, were you suggesting that people that have their own service would not be charged by us?
Well, what I'm saying is that I think that the idea is that every developed parcel will be billed, period. That was kind of the thought. The question really is around undeveloped parcels, whether it's just a vacant lot. Do we impose on them sort of through a policy that, sorry, you're still going to be billed because there's a presumption that they use services to some extent? We could take the approach that the parcels that are vacant, we're going to allow them to not be billed, but we will make sure that we convey that information, those parcels, to Republic, so they know not to service those parcels and to remove any containers they may have provided them, even if it's just green waste. That would be kind of my suggested approach. If you wanted to be more onerous, you could you could take it to the next level and require that the property owners give us evidence that they are, in fact, are taking things to the proper facility for disposal, whether it be green waste or anything else. I'm not suggesting we do that, but, you know, those two are kind of ways for us to approach this.
And Robert, just so that you'll know, just a slight correction, they do, Republic at this point, they're going to be going to probably within a year or so, but they do not provide any bins. So when you say they would not put any containers that Republic had, they would take them back, all of our containers are our own.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Except for manure and stuff like that, which is totally separate.
Yeah, they're private, it's everybody's own individual trash can, whether it's plastic or,
Interesting.
yeah, we don't
Well,
have
that's
any color.
even, that, yeah. Well, that, you know, that makes things even a little more challenging because from Republic, you know, when you mentioned that they would call Republic, no, there is never, I can't think of any circumstance or situation where a resident would have the need to call Republic because Republic doesn't provide them containers, so they're not going to call them to ask for a new container or replacement container or additional containers because they're not, because they're owned by themselves. So why would they ever have a need to call Republic? There is no need.
They don't get picked up.
And whether it's about billing, if they would come to us if they had any billing questions, because we're the ones essentially doing the billing, not through the county, of course, but Republic's not even involved in that part of it. So Republic has no role other than to show up twice a week and pick up whatever containers are there, and they get paid for that.
So, the list that we give a list to Republic, do I understand that correctly? Of who to,
No,
we don't?
no, I'm not that I'm aware of.
Okay, because, you know, you're talking about, if we're gonna look at undeveloped parcels, you know, most undeveloped parcels don't have addresses. So I don't know how
Okay.
we tell Republic, don't pick up from this address when there is no address on record. It's an area between two other addresses, but it doesn't have, it probably won't have its own designated address.
Well, and for me, I think on average, or in general, I don't think that a undeveloped property is probably using, like if they have gardeners coming and things like that, they're not using our Republic's green waste to pick that up. And so, but they may be using the large, you know, the supplemental services that we do, that we provide. And if they did put bins out there, Republic, as you said, they would just, they're not, if we don't bill them anything, and it looks like we're not billing them anything now, and if we decide to make the policy that we don't going forward, if you don't tell Republic that, hey, we're not collecting from these people, that it's undeveloped property, and if you know, under your scenario too, where you're asking Republic to verify, you know, not verify, but say, hey, this is an undeveloped property, don't pick up from them, then that does put the illness on Republic. But I still don't think that when you've got these major, the one thing that undeveloped properties do when they have to do their fire clearance, but most of that is usually just weed abatement. And weed abatement, people aren't usually taking weeds in their trash. They cut them and they leave them there. They just die on the ground. You just weed whack them. Now, if they've got issues with trees and big shrubs, there is your situation when they could be putting stuff out to be picked up by the regular hauler. I would say for the most part, I do see the gardeners that are doing that work or the tree trimming people carrying it away. I don't see it being left. But that doesn't, just because I haven't seen it, doesn't mean it doesn't happen. So that's why I'm, like I said, I'm mixed from the beginning. Maybe you start out and you say, since it's just a policy, it can be changed, but maybe we don't, if Pat's uncomfortable with that, maybe we don't charge them
Well, I think
anything.
I'm leaning that direction, but I think we should still, as part of our policy, specify that if you're not paying for trash collection, you're not entitled, you're
Right.
not allowed
Right.
to use any of the services, whether it's a trash can in front of the property.
Correct.
Or a bulky, item pickup.
Right. Or the shredding
green-
event, or or the,
No.
communal bins,
We really don't have the ability to
enforce that.
monitor that.
Right.
But at least it should be made clear, so there's no, well, why can't we use the bulky item pickup?
If you're not
It says
paying
right
for it,
here,
yeah, if you're not paying for it. I mean,
Yeah.
I would
Well, maybe-
be happy with making that type of a recommendation, that at this point, we don't charge undeveloped properties any trash thing, but
Yeah.
that would include Pat's recommendation about that the property owners would be told XXXX. And
Right.
we would also, I think, have to tell Republic, on these undeveloped properties, there's nobody there. And I don't mean nobody living there. There's not structures there.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask about that. How do we define undeveloped? And I'm not trying to be cute about this, but I mean, I can think of one property in Rolling Hills that's got a
Stable.
rather large barn on
Barn,
it.
yeah.
And probably a illegal dwelling unit on it. But I certainly think that's developed.
Yeah, I would say structure, and I think you could use the same definition of structure. Structure's not a fence, but a structure's a barn,
Shed, outbuilding.
a barn shed, outbuilding. It's a structure. It's a structure, not a fence. A fence isn't a structure.
If I can
Yeah.
provide some information, I spoke to our representative from the Weights and Measures, LA County Agricultural Commissioners. They're the ones that go out there and they look at vacant properties to make sure that they are maintained. And when they see properties that haven't been maintained, there's a lot of vegetation growing on there and they need to be trimmed, they'll contact the property owner and let them know. If the property owner doesn't do anything, they'll go out there and do the work themselves and then put the bill on the property owner by putting it
Right.
in the tax.
Right, right.
So in terms of if they actually haul it themselves, or like what you mentioned, I guess, maybe they just, mow it down and, leave it there.
Mowing it down, and that's what most of the vacant, not all of them, but most of the vacant properties do. Because if they're not maintaining stuff in the canyons and things like that, we have people living on their properties that don't maintain that. But for the most part, where the building pads would be, you're just talking about that, about the weed whacking. And and so, as John said, you've got different, the fire department on a structure, on something with a building on it, has their 200 foot. And so that work has to be done. So then you can start getting a lot of trees and things like that, whereas the ag does the whole, supposedly the whole property. They don't go into the canyons and do much.
Yeah.
They may say they do,
Can
but
I
they
make
don't.
a, Sorry,
Those
sorry,
people with a structure that are having to do everything within 200 feet, not just weed whack, those people could conceivably be putting stuff in their
right.
bins. And so that's why I think Pat and I are in agreement
Yeah.
on the
So
ones
let
with,
me make a few observations and then maybe a suggestion. One, since those vacant lots don't have an address, I'm just wondering how, what we communicate to Republic as what if it's just, unilaterally all vacant lots are not going to be serviced. But, it's going to be without an address, that might be a little bit of a challenge. And then another observation is that there might be some parcels that are vacant where they do use the services and want to continue using the services. And so we'd have to make that determination. But enforcement is going to be difficult for those who don't want it and to make sure they're not using services. So I'm wondering of a better approach, more kind of a hybrid approach that I think the committee member Mersch mentioned is, why don't we charge a nominal fee like $250 or something like that? That's well below the normal $1,100. And then they're able to utilize services that we know are going to be limited just because we're dealing with green waste. Now we're not dealing with the more complicated mixed waste, containers and regular trash. It's going to be more infrequent. It's just going to be grass, and they can use the other services that we have. But at least we're charging them some nominal amount, and then they can decide whether they use them or not. But they're at least being paid on the presumption that they have the ability, and we can't control or enforce whether they use those services or not. So it might be a better approach to charge all vacant lots a nominal amount.
I would rather either charge the full amount or not charge. And regarding the ones that are using the service, if we discontinue the service, they'll let us know right away, and then we can let them opt in. We should have an opt-in policy for the undeveloped lots. But I think it's just one more step. It makes the process more complicated to have a split rate. For the staff, at least, that's what I'm thinking of. They have to monitor and manage, different rates for different parcels, and these parcels don't have addresses. So how do you put the APN number in, trying to manage like that? I think it would just get really hard.
And I agree with Pat, even though I was the one that, when I was just throwing it out, said, maybe you bill them half or something like that. I do think that that's better. The one thing I will say is that these undeveloped properties, and I forget how many when we were doing our housing element. I think it's like 14 or 15. It isn't, do you remember, John, how many it was? Undeveloped vacant
I
properties?
heard 15 in this from
Unve-
Robert. That's what I thought I heard.
No, vacant properties,
Based on the
vacant.
housing, I think there were like 20 that were kind of developable, but there were actually more than 20. There's like little small, remnant parcels.
Right.
Development vacant.
Right. The ones that could be developed. I mean, we've got obviously areas that aren't.
Yeah.
But they're very easy to see. I don't think that Republic is going and collecting on those. I mean, I've been on audit. I've done a ride along with Republic, and they know really well, hey, this, there's not a property there. And I would be willing to go along with another one and then do another ride along with it. I don't think it should be that difficult to tell Republic, hey, you don't need to pick up. Don't pick up from this address. It's an undeveloped parcel. And they're not supposed to be generating waste. And so to Pat's thing, if you give them what the ground rules are, that we're not going to charge you anything, but that means no, this, and this, and then, John, we'd have to add in there, and all waste coming from there must meet all the criterias of, SB whatever, and go to the proper facilities and that kind of stuff. You'd have advise them. Can we really control it and police it? No. But I think at least to start, that would be a good way to do it.
Okay. And then I guess presumably we would do is we would send a letter to those property owners of those parcels that are in fact undeveloped, and advise them that unless they want to receive services and pay for that full amount, $1,100, whatever that dollar amount is, that they will no longer be receiving services, or at least will not receive services, and will be instructing Republic not to provide services, and including all the other stuff that comes with that. And just advise them that we're not going to be able to, it's going to be difficult to monitor and enforce, but we'll at least advise them, but they won't be billed, and they have the ability at that point to let us know that, no, we've been receiving services, or we want to receive services, and we're comfortable being charged for that.
And so if they're advised that, we're not going to be charging you for it, that means you're responsible to get any refuse from there out to, to follow all guidelines, whoever's guidelines those are, to the correct, in the correct manner, and you are not entitled to use any of the communal services.
Right.
I think we should have a policy before we send these letters out to make sure.
Oh,
that
yeah,
we
yeah,
send it
but we're gonna be recommending the policy, that's what I'm just saying. So when we recommend the policy, I think that would be part of our recommendation, that it would include
Right.
that type of thing. I'm not talking about drafting the letter now, but that would be something that we would have, and say, and if you would like to have service, be able to use the services, you can opt in, and you would be billed at whatever the rate is that we bill, develop
Is there gonna
properties.
be any, with the 15 undeveloped sites, is there gonna be any uncertainty before we send this letter we're talking about out, whether they're currently paying or not paying? I mean, it would be kind of weird to send a letter to somebody that's not paying for a service and say you're not gonna get service. Or actually, it's the other way around. It would be weird to send a letter to somebody that's paying for it and doesn't even know they're paying for it, and then they weren't using the service. In other words, is this gonna generate a request for a refund?
Well, I think.
No. I guess the approach would be that those parcels that have historically not been billed will be the ones that will receive a letter that we just talked about. We won't be sending a letter to any parcels that have been billed. We may find throughout we may find that there are other parcels that have been billed, and we could, we'd have to kind of help figure out how we address that, because there could be some parcels that are vacant and for whatever reason have been billed. I don't think that's going to be the case, but we know the ones that have not been billed, and we'll have to just verify that they've not been billed because they are in fact vacant lots. And assuming they are, and then that's how we'll address that.
Okay, I'm sorry to keep belaboring this point, but are there developed parcels that we're not billing right now?
Every year there are developed parcels that have not been billed because, again, there was that shift in 2020 that if they temporarily stop receiving services, like they're under construction for 6 months, they were not billed, or unoccupied temporarily were not billed.
Wow, so somebody had to make a specific request for this, and then somebody at the city had to agree to it? What do you mean, no?
No, and again, we basically, every year, we would have, the prior year files and documentation, but then the Republic would do a route audit, again, in April, May, and they would make notes, they would find us a list of the addresses and the status of them, and they would identify to us, oh, this property is under construction. And this is in April or May, before the fiscal year even starts, and that's what makes it arbitrary, but they provide us, it's unoccupied, not receiving services or whatever, And so they're the ones that we have been advising us that these are temporary, they have temporary suspension of services, and we use that, or it has been used, to not bill those parcels.
Well, they're used to doing it the way they do it everywhere else, which is if somebody discontinues service, then they just stop billing them, they stop picking up. But it's obviously different here, where normally it would be the homeowner or the apartment dweller that requests the suspension of services. In our case, it's a Republic requesting the suspension.
Yeah, and well, Republic isn't really. Normally the hauler would have the billing records, or the city would have the billing records, all the account records, and know exactly who's getting services and who's not, who's paying and who's not. And if they weren't paying, they would not have containers. It doesn't, this is a whole different kind of approach where Republic doesn't know. If you were to call them today, is this property address receiving services? They won't know. They have no way of knowing that. What they do then is once a year they go out, and I don't know whether it's for a week or 2 weeks, like the ones that you were talking about, the ride-alongs, the drivers will make a visual determination, like about this time of the year, related to next fiscal year that we're billing, as to whether the property is unoccupied or under construction. And that has been the basis for them not being billed for the next year. And that's why I say it's both arbitrary and perhaps inconsistent, because maybe the construction ended June 30 and they were fully occupied for the entire fiscal year, but we're making these determinations in April and May. So that's what we want to get away from. I believe, on at that level. And then we deal with the ones that have not been built at all. Again, presumably that's because they are vacant lots, and we can, and the direction is we won't build them. We won't, and now for the first time, we won't start building them. We'll continue to not build them, but we want to verify that they are in fact vacant. And if they are, we will send them letters and so forth. For those that we find are not vacant, and for whatever reason just have not been billed incorrectly, we'll add them to the mix.
Okay.
Do we need to have some type of, and I hate to even bring this up, but do we need to have somewhere in our policy of a provision about if somebody's going to want to make an appeal, like when you send these letters out to somebody that's the owner of a property that hasn't had anybody live on it in, 5 years, and and if they haven't been, if we haven't been billing them, if we're going to start billing somebody that we didn't used to bill, and we're going to send a letter to them, do we need to have some type of basis on which we would consider an appeal? That's...
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the policy was what that is. And the policy, as I understand it, is that if a property that's developed, if a property is developed, they're going to get billed, even if there is a temporary or long-term lack of occupancy. That's the direction I heard, that it's a parcel and it's developed, that there's at some point in some way or fashion, they're going to utilize the services. And so they're going to be billed. So that's that. If we find that some parcels are like that, developed but haven't been built in the past, we're going to start billing them, and then they can raise an issue of that. But you're going to tell them that sorry, you are appropriately being billed because that's our policy. And then if the other situation might be where if they've not been billed, but they should have been billed because they thought there was a vacant lot, but maybe they weren't, and they've never been billed, but it's even occupied, but it's a residential property, we're going to start billing them, and we might get some feedback about that, but we still have a basis in a policy that says, yeah, you should be billed, and we're not going to go after you for previous years that you didn't pay, but you're certainly going to start paying now.
Right.
But I understand your point about somebody somewhere will have some kind of exception, they think.
That they're going to want, yeah. And so maybe we just do it on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah,
and
there should be a provision for an appeal. I'm just trying to think what would constitute, under what conditions would the appeal be granted? I mean, if the homeowner had absolutely no utility connection to the home, clearly they're not living there now, but there's always a possibility that they're going to move in next month or something like that.
I know. And those, I guess, that was just my brain kind of putting it out there, not that, I think that staff should be able to deal with that on any of those questions that come up. I mean, I really don't think there's going to be that many of them.
There's always going to be one or two very vocal ones,
right,
though, that
right.
are going to make it uncomfortable.
Right. John, what do you, and Christian, I mean, what do you?
But I guess the policy should, so we shouldn't leave things up to kind of chance, or I think policy should be clear about how we're going to deal with either exemptions or not exemptions. So if you look at the PowerPoint, you'll see that on even a policy approach, we might offer an opportunity, except, we already talked about vacant lots, so we know that they're not going to be billed, fine, unless they want to be billed. But for parcels that are developed, we have the direction that I've heard so far is that they're going to be billed because whether they're occupied or not, because there's a presumption that they're utilizing and will utilize services to some degree. But that is an area where if you want to have property owners to be able to get waived from being billed because it's just permanently occupied, if you think that's a reasonable reason for not being billed at all because it's a vacant house, and I'm not sure that that's even common or even occurs, that you could do that. I don't know that that's a common occurrence, but if you want to provide for some kind of exemption where the property is truly unoccupied on a permanent basis and the fact that they're not really generating any kind of waste that's meaningful. They're almost like a vacant lot. We could provide that as a way, an exemption, but that's not what I'm hearing so far.
Well, maybe, so I'm not looking for an exemption. There are instances where we have had people, and I'm not talking about undeveloped properties now. I'm talking about properties
Okay.
where they're saying that nobody is living there, that they're unoccupied.
Yeah.
There are people that have put out trailers. They're actually living in a trailer. They could be putting stuff out. Maybe what we do, and if we don't have a backup, not a backup, but if we haven't addressed, well, what if somebody has this situation or that situation? When we make this I've made enough recommendations to council, they're going to pick apart every little thing, and they're going to want to know, well, what about if this happens, or what about if that happens? I think we ought to have in our recommendation, if on a developed property, someone makes a claim that, gee, nobody lives there or whatever, and they can substantiate that in that case, I don't think we should waive it. And I understand Pat's thing about not wanting to have a two-tier system or anything like that, but in the rare situation where that might happen, okay, you only have to pay half.
That's fine.
I mean, does that seem fair? I mean,
Fine with me. I don't have to deal with the administration of it.
yeah, well, and so, I would ask staff that,
I would just offer, and this is anecdotally and not meant to influence the committee's
it never would.
point of view.
Make DC
But
Christian.
Much of yourself, Christian.
And I would need to do some research, and maybe Robert has already, but anecdotally, I am not aware of any other city that allows for some type of exemption or tiered system. If you own a property, regardless of whether it's developed or undeveloped, you pay your property taxes, and a part of your property taxes includes any assessments that city has for schools, for trash, or whatnot, are a part and parcel of that property tax bill, and it's very clean and simple.
But outside of the property tax collection process, which we use, if you own a house in Redondo Beach and that house is vacant, you don't need utilities, you cancel your trash service, you can do that though, can't you?
I'm not aware of the ability to contact the county and have them
No,
remove.
I get what you're saying.
So that's what I'm like. And
It's
as
to the
now
hauler.
a property owner that does not live in a home, I would need to do the research to see, is that even an option? But I can't imagine that it would be, because it does get very complicated both for the county and or the municipality to start to.
Yeah, I wouldn't
Yeah.
want the resident or the homeowner to contact the county and the county to act on that by any
Yeah.
means. And I don't think they would.
Yeah, if I can jump in, that's really, so the county in our situation would never be the place people to contact. All they're doing is they're our billing department, if you will. But I have looked at a number of ordinances that have mandatory ordinances, and they do provide exemptions. And again, this is where enforcement becomes, staff intensive. They do provide exemptions in many cases if they can demonstrate through providing on a monthly or quarterly basis waste tickets. They can demonstrate that they're self-hauling the material, or through a private hauler, that they have to provide evidence of that. That's the only way. Or they can demonstrate that the lack of any services is not going to generate any public nuisance or any kind of, health hazard. It could be a parcel that is just a vacant and it's an asphalt lot. You can imagine a lot that it's just asphalt. It's not going to need any services. But there are exemptions in that case, and whether they're billed directly by the hauler or on behalf of the city, billed by the city, or billed through the direct assessment method that we use through the county, there are typically exemptions. They're enforcement sort of, intensive, because you got to have staff then who are dealing with those matters and doing the enforcement and all that. And I'm assuming we don't want to go there, but if we want to, from a policy perspective, say if again it's going to become more staff intensive, if we want to give them an exemption because they can demonstrate to us that it's developed, but they're not using any services, or they're self-hauling, we could provide that. And I can imagine somebody arguing that. It just means that we're going to have to say, okay, well, prove it to us. The burden of proof is on you to show us through waste tickets or other means or, other evidence that they are not using the services provided by Republic, because we have no way of controlling that, because they can easily be using Republic services. Where in other situations, the hauler is providing the containers, they can remove them, and they can control that they're not receiving services. Here, we can't control whether or not they use services. It's a little more difficult. So that's why I think allowing an exemption for developed property is going to be a little bit problematic, because it's hard to monitor, hard to know, hard to be sure, and hard to enforce. Better to say that every developed property gets billed, and if they really come back and provide us some kind of reason that is compelling, we can evaluate each one on a case-by-case basis, and if it's appropriate, we'll reimburse them for whatever they might have been billed.
Okay, but just so I understand this correctly, are we talking about an exemption for developed lots?
Yeah, that's what we're talking about. So we're going to categorically say that unless they want the services, we're going to not bill for the vacant lots.
But we're
For developed lots.
We're gonna bill them for this, and it's up to them to appeal this. Is that the?
Well, I mean,
No,
if we
not
have
for-
an
not
appeal
for
process, maybe we just make it simple. You and I make a recommendation, we don't put anything in there about the appeal. If the council is gonna say, well, what about this and what about that? The reason I was trying to put something in there was to try and make that discussion at a full council meeting. To me, that's our job, is to get it as precise as possible to make the presentation.
Yeah.
But maybe on something like this, who knows, they're probably not even gonna be all that terrifically happy about saying that we're gonna bill,
Well, let's start out by saying even though we weren't asked, we recommend that we increase the trash rate to 14,000.
yeah, different issue.
No, I
Different
know,
issue.
I know, but it'll
No.
raise so much.
I'm saving my ammo on that. That's a whole other issue. That's a whole other issue. And that's why we don't have a lot of people in the audience. If they thought we were talking about what we were gonna do with the trash rate, believe me, that audience would be.
I don't think anybody cares.
Yeah, what I would suggest is I like the approach of, with vacant lots, it's opt-in, but the default is we're not going to build vacant lots. They can opt into the light. And then the other policy is that if there's a structure there, that they are going to get billed. There's no exemptions, because it's too hard to manage or control or monitor or deal with exemptions. No exemptions, you're going to get billed. But if somebody wanted to argue the point, we would certainly address that on a case-by-case basis, but we wouldn't offer any categories of exemptions. We would leave it up to them to tell us, wait a minute, I don't believe I should, and then we can address it. And if we've already billed them, we can reimburse them, or they've come to us in advance. We can evaluate it on a case-by-case basis.
And we can always, and if this becomes an issue, that's one reason you do a policy instead of an ordinance. It's a lot easier to change and a lot less expensive. So we just make our two basic recommendations. What do you think, Pat?
Yep.
Yeah, totally agree. It's fluid, it's easy to change. We can, revisit this later on.
So is that direction to
I'll
staff?
and Robert, I'm just gonna read what I have here and just tell me if it's clear, and then we can blue folder that if you want on Monday, so that the rest of the council can see it in writing, and then you can, of course, verbally share. But the recommendation would be that, one, we will have a policy that will not bill vacant lots unless they choose to opt in.
By vacant,
Vacant, undeveloped.
Undeveloped.
Yes, and then that, two, developed lots, meaning any structure on the property, would be automatically billed, and then it's up to you if you want to add in any language, whether or not that they could be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, as Robert mentioned, if they felt that they were not, they shouldn't be paying.
So would we not want to put that other part in there about it's up to you? I mean, just even leave that and let them raise the
It
question?
seems like that would make it a bit messier if you
It's gonna
put.
generate more
yeah.
discussion. If somebody wants to discuss it, fine.
Yeah.
But there's no reason for us to
Right.
prompt that discussion.
So we just have the two clean recommendations, right, Pat?
Okay, so Robert, if you want to draft something up, we'll add it as a blue folder item on Monday, and then the committee can present it as part of their verbal report.
And for the background on it, I like what you did as far as why we want to say why we're establishing this policy. And we're establishing this policy for consistency of billing, to make sure that trash is, that refuse is disposed of in the proper manner, and and to have consistency in the billing to help us to enable us to reconcile our billing records that we put on the tax bills.
I was gonna
Yeah,
say.
and there's also an equity issue because I think that,
Addressing it.
and I think we're going to address the equity issue because that's what this does, because there may be parcels that for 2 months out of the fiscal year were under construction, and yet they didn't pay anything, so that's really not fair. So that part of this is to address some equity issues and making sure people are paying their fair share for services received.
Well, and we actually have, parcels that are under construction for months and months and months. And even, it can go into years. And maybe on some of those properties, in some of those instances, they're not getting any trash services. But we don't have any way to control that they're not getting any trash services.
No way to know that.
We issue them C&D permits. They'd have to come in and get their C&D permit, and that allows them to kind of haul their own waste
Right.
on their own, and they're responsible for recycling up to 65%.
But when they find out that we have unlimited trash pickup here, John, that's the problem. They go, I have actually had people say, if I take this to the dump for you, it's going to cost me X amount of money. If I cut it up and put it in your green waste containers or bind it for green waste, it won't charge you anything. They do that. I know. So I think that's why. I mean, the service is still available for them if they choose
Yes,
to use it.
yes.
Robert, I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's not a limit on how many trash cans you can put out?
Is that a statement or is that a question?
No, he's making, it's a
I'm not
truth.
sure if you're aware of that.
Oh, no. So they can put as much as they want out?
Yeah.
15, 20,
Yeesh.
25?
Yeah, as long as they don't weigh too much.
Under 65 pounds and,
And plus, we have the green waste pickups, which is, again, unlimited. You have people that have taken down 10 or 15 trees, and they're just all chopped up and lined out.
And you could take a
In
month
front.
or so, just fill up 15, 20
Yeah.
trash cans each
Yeah.
week, and then over the course of a month, that it'll all be gone.
Yeah,
Yeah. So,
yeah.
I
And
worry
that's why I
about
think
the
this
construction
approach makes,
Of using that.
and that's why I think this approach makes sense, because there's no way for us to know that or control that or to stop that. So that the fact that it's available, people, like you said, committee member Mersch, that why would they incur the cost to take it, to a dump or wherever, when they can just put it in a number of containers and reduce their bill? It's free, or sort of free in a sense. They've already paid for it, why not?
I think Robert's thinking about bringing his trash here.
people do. I know it sounds bizarre, but when you live in a
No, I'm
city
not
that only
surprised.
allows you one bin, and you
Yes.
took down a big bush, can I come use your service? I'm a council member, you cannot come use my service.
You're right. I did some tree trimming, and I had to basically, it took me like 6 weeks to be able to get it into the containers. I just had to store it on the side of the yard until I had them, little by little, I put in my green waste container because I'm limited in that.
What I have had in PVE, you can put out more. They don't number it. But I have had friends come to me and say, "Can I borrow some of your extra containers so that I can get it?" They're not trying to bring their waste here, but PVE is probably
Right.
going to have to go away from it as as well. Most cities don't do that. So are you good with direction on
I think,
that?
so. Robert, you good with that?
Yep, I'm good.
Okay.
Thank you, Robert. And we're not listening to, never mind. I was going to say something, but I changed my mind.
All right, items from
All right.
staff,
I don't have anything, John?
None.
Okay.
items from committee,
Well,
we all done?
Yeah.
thank you both. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Robert.
So we're adjourned, right?
Yes.
Bye-bye.